Hi, and welcome to this tutorial on using the SimpleBake add-on for Blender to export models from Blender to Sketchfab. Just as a word at the start, I am not someone who regularly uploads tutorials to YouTube or anything to YouTube for that matter. So this is probably going to be a bit rough around the edges. It's not going to be as polished as some of the stuff you're used to listening to. Please bear with me. We will get there. It's just, as I say, I'm not very experienced in this kind of thing, so you'll have to cut me some slack. So SimpleBake is an add-on for Blender that's available on the Blender Market and also on Gumroad. It sums up here in the introduction the reason why it exists. Essentially, Blender has a very powerful way of creating materials, a very good kind of materials creation process using nodes, which I'm sure if you're watching this video you're familiar with. The difficulty comes when you're trying to get those materials out of Blender and into something else. If you're rendering an image or a video with Blender, then it's all fine. But if you want to upload something to Sketchfab, or you want to take those materials to something like 3D Coat or Substance Painter, it's a painful process to bake out those materials, and it's not really designed with a kind of PBR workflow in mind. The bake modes that Blender traditionally offers are more sort of, I guess you could say, old-fashioned. They're not the kind of bake modes you would need for exporting something to Sketchfab, for example, which is what this tutorial is going to cover. That's where SimpleBake intends to kind of come in and solve the problem. That's why it exists. So you can see a brief description of how to use it and how it will show up in Blender on the Blender Market page. And I particularly draw to your attention the frequently asked questions section. I've put a fair amount of effort into this based on feedback from a number of users, just things that were not quite clear or people who didn't quite understand the sort of the concepts of baking and texture maps and things like that. I've put a fair amount of information into there, so I'd highly recommend giving that a review. So I've opened up Blender here, and it's currently displaying a model I created a couple of months ago. It's, if you're into Star Trek, it's the USS Discovery from the Star Trek TV show Star Trek Discovery. If you're not into Star Trek, it's a spaceship. It doesn't really matter for the purpose of this tutorial. It's essentially a typical Blender model. It's something I've combined into two objects, which you can see here in the right panel. We have one object called the drive section and one object called saucer. Both these objects contain a number of different materials. You can see here there's lots of different materials in the saucer object. And similarly, there's a lot of different materials here in the drive section object. So if we go into the shading workspace, you can see that all these materials are essentially built around the principled BSDF and emission shaders, sometimes mixing them together, sometimes more than one, sometimes just the single shader in the case of the lights. But it's always those shaders, and it's those shaders you're really going to need if you're creating PBR materials in Blender. Those are the shaders that really represent physically based materials. You can see here that I'm feeding different inputs into each one. Sometimes they're reasonably complicated, sometimes they're not. For example, like that, it's just an emission. But anyway, baking these objects out in Blender using Blender's kind of default approach would be a painstakingly time-sucking process. You'd essentially have to go through each of the materials, add an image node. If you wanted to bake out PBR maps, you'd have to essentially run through each of the inputs into the principal BSDF one by one into maybe a diffuse output and just bake them off one by one. It would be laborious, and that's the whole reason behind SimpleBake existing, is to automate that process. So if I bring up my render tab here and we go down to the bottom, you can see we've got the SimpleBake Addon panel. This panel gives you the PBR bake map options that you'd be more familiar with if you've done any kind of PBR based materials creation before. So you can bake out color, metal, normal, rough, transmission roughness, and emission. Those are essentially mapped to the inputs of the Principal BSDF node. If anyone has any interest in baking any more of these inputs, please let me know. It's fairly trivial to add them to as an option to the add-on, but personally I've never needed anything more than the ones that are currently listed, which is why they're the ones that are currently there. Further down we have the global settings, so you've got the margin here, which you're probably familiar with from any other kind of baking in Blender. It's essentially the margin between the UV islands. Generate new UVs, so if you tick this, essentially SimpleBake will smart UV project each of the objects, creating a new UV map for each, so that can be handy if you're in a hurry and you haven't already got a pre-existing UV map. Use alpha means that the baked images will have a alpha background. Merge PBR bakes is a way of baking multiple objects to the same UV map. So if I were to select these two objects at once and I were to click merge UV bakes, then it would bake both of these to the new UV map. If you do generate new UVs, it will create a big new UV map. If you don't, it will use the existing UV map, so you have to make sure they don't overlap. Again, see the FAQ section on the Blender Market page for more details of how that kind of thing works. You'll notice it's grayed out at the moment. That's because I've got use alpha checked. You can't use both of these at the same time. It seems to be a limitation of the way Blender bakes. If I find a way around that in the future, I'll of course update the add-on to take it into account, but at the moment, if you are using alpha, you can't use merge PBR bakes. Export bakes is what it sounds like. So again, I'll keep sounding like a broken record here, but if you look at the FAQ section on the Blender Market page, I talk about how Blender always saves images that are created internally to Blender, and they do not get saved along with your blend file. So this can catch out new users. It certainly caught me out when I was a new user. You edit images within Blender, you create images within Blender, usually in somebody's on my mouse there. Okay. Usually in the where are we? UV image editor. You save the blend file and they don't save along with the file. So checking this option will mean that SimpleBake will export all your bakes to the folder in which your blend file is saved, and that option will be grayed out if your blend file isn't saved. Export mesh is another quite handy option, so it will export the mesh in an FBX format, again into the same folder that exports the bakes. And this will have a single material per object and a single UV map, being the UV map you use to bake, either the new one created by SimpleBake if you use this option, or the previous SimpleBake UV map if you didn't, and that will export a copy of your FBX file ready for uploading to Sketchfab or similar. These buttons here are just setting a quick way of setting the resolutions down here. So you can type it in manually. So if you're doing a very quick bake, just to check everything looks okay, which I'd strongly recommend you do. I'd set it to something like 128, 128. If you're baking out other maps, you can just quickly set the options down here. PBR map bake will bake what it sounds like a PBR map. So it will bake out these maps that you've ticked up here. Color ID bake will bake a image where you have a separate material for a separate color for each material. So this would have a specific color, this would have a different color, this would have a different color. That's very useful if you're exporting to something like Substance Painter, where it uses a color ID map as a basis for applying materials. So that's just there as an option. Cycles bake is probably outside the scope of this specific video, but what it will do is essentially it will bake the settings you have up here. So at the moment I've got it set to emit, but I could set it to the old-fashioned, if you like, cycle bake methods. Again, see the FAQs for details on that. But essentially SimpleBake will still handle all the awkward creating material nodes and all the other setup you need to make a bake work properly, but it will take its settings from this panel. So essentially it's only really this that's then relevant. This is ignored because this is only for PBR map baking. Show guide is just a quick link to the guide on my website, which actually now just links through to the Blender Market page, so it's kind of redundant. I'll probably remove that button in future versions. Okay. So having said all that, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select both the objects, so make sure they're the only things selected. If I select anything else, like camera for example, SimpleBake will warn me that not all selected objects are mesh. These particular objects have UV maps already. So you'll see here that they've got a number of UV maps that are used. So windows and lights are used specifically. This may actually, is this the right texture? No. Yes, okay, so there's an example. So it uses the Windows UVs explicitly, but the active UV map and the one for rendering here it is just called UV map, and it's the same with this. So these UV maps, as we can see, if we go to, I seem to have lost my header. Oh, there it is. Okay, I've got it back. If you go to UV editing, sorry, I'm having problems with my keyboard today. We can see that UV map for both those objects is essentially just a full UV map of all faces. So this is suitable for baking. If you're going to bake, you need a UV map that is representative of all. So every part of your model is nicely flatly mapped out so that it can be baked too. And I've done that manually in this case. If I hadn't, I could get SimpleBake to generate the UVs for me. But sometimes that, a smart UV project is not going to give a fantastic result for this model. So I've manually created the UV map in this case. So let's bring that the right way up. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to select both of these things. I'm going to make sure I've got the UV maps I want, so that's right. There's not really any transmission on this, so we'll just keep those deselected. I don't want new UVs. See the FAQs for how UVs are handled. So essentially SimpleBake will look for a map called SimpleBake. First of all, it will generate new UVs if you ask it to. If not, it will look for a map called SimpleBake. And if not, it will use the active UV map. Here it's just going to use the active UV map, that UV map called UV map, for both objects. So I'm going to merge these off. I'm going to have a resolution of 4K. This memory usage option, my computer's reasonably high powered, so I'm going to leave it at no limit. But if you experience problems, push it down to one of the other options. I think it starts off set at normal. That's it. I'm just going to hit bake. Now Blender will lock up, so you see I can't click on anything now. Nothing's going to work, and that's the reason I strongly suggest that you start SimpleBake. Start Blender rather when you're using SimpleBake from the terminal. So in Linux that I'm using here, this is what the terminal looks like. In Windows, it will be the command prompt. I don't know what it is in Mac OS because I don't use Mac OS, but you'll probably know yourself. If you do start it from the terminal, that allows you to see the output. So you can see I've got some idea of what's going on. Even so, because I'm doing this at 4K, and though my computer's not too bad, it will still take a bit of time. Baking always does. You can see it is getting on with it, but I'm still going to pause the recording anyway, and we'll come back when it's finished creating those images. Okay, so that's finished now. We can see that Blender's started displaying the last image to have been baked. I'm not going to concern myself too much with the images that are inside Blender. You can see those zeros there indicate that the image will not be saved along with the blend file, which is the point I was getting into before when we were talking about export bakes. I have turned on the export bakes option, so we'll just ignore the images that are in Blender, and I'll go to where I have my blend file saved, which is in this discovery folder in my file browser. See there's a new folder has been created, SimpleBake_bakes, and in that we'll find everything that's been baked along with the FBX, which is the model export, because I had that export mesh option. So now we'll just pop over to Sketchfab and upload those. Okay, so here I am in Sketchfab. I'm going to click upload, unsurprisingly, choose file, and you'll see that I'm in the directory I was just in before, which is the SimpleBake bakes under where I've saved my model. I'm going to upload the .fbx file for now, so we'll just click continue. Sometimes this is very fast, sometimes it takes a little bit of time. I have actually already uploaded this model, so I'm just going to call this something specific like SimpleBake Tutorial. That'll do. We'll select a category. I usually go with cars and vehicles. I don't know if that's the correct one for something like a spaceship, but it doesn't matter too much. We'll put a tag. I'm not actually going to keep this upload because it's just for demonstrating the for this video really. So, but we'll put a tag anyway. I'll click continue. Sketchfab will process the model, so that will take a little bit of time. Although sometimes, like that, it's extremely quick. That was very impressive. So here it is. You can see that the model has been uploaded correctly. It's looking good. I'll now go immediately to 3D settings. And what I will do is I will go over here to the materials tab, pick any of these, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to open them. You'll see I'm in that same directory again, SimpleBake Bakes. I'm going to select everything in this directory and click open, and you'll see they'll all get uploaded. And then for this specific one that we've selected, it's actually color for the saucer. So I'll just filter by saucer and do color. So one thing I forgot to mention is that because we exported the model with SimpleBake, it's exported it with two materials and two UV maps that match those materials. So I've got saucer and dry section, just like the objects I had in Blender. So going through the saucer materials first of all, I've done the color. I'll go into here, it's still filtered by saucer, so I'll go to saucer metal. I'll go down here to roughness, glossiness, select roughness because we're using a metal roughness workflow. Saucer roughness. I'll go down here to normal map, turn on the normal map, open it up, saucer normal map, and last but not least, I'll open up the one for saucer emission. And you can see the saucer's looking quite good. So it is a bit time consuming, but you only have to do it once. I'll just go through now and I'll do the same thing again for the drive section. So I will change it to drive. So color, drive metal, change it to roughness again because we're using a roughness workflow. Drive roughness, turn on normal map, drive normal, and emission. Drive emission. There we go. You see it's looking quite good already. What we're going to do now is go into lighting, change the HDRI to something a bit more suitable. One of the space ones is probably an obvious choice. Quite bright though. So I'm going to bring that down, and instead I'm just going to add one of Sketchfab's very handy lighting presets, so maybe we'll go for something like that. I don't know. You can play with the lighting till your heart's content, obviously. As I say, I have already uploaded this model, so I've spent a lot of time playing with the lighting in the backgrounds and things like that. So I'll show you that briefly. I'll just save this for now. I suppose we don't really need to wait for it, to be honest. Let's go back to Sketchfab. Here, go to my uploaded models, and this is the one I've already got active. So I've spent a bit of time playing with the lighting on this one, so it looks better, but it's the exact same model and the exact same textures that I baked out previously, and you can see that it looks a lot better. So I hope that's helpful. I hope you found that useful. Thank you for your interest in SimpleBake, and happy baking.